And we're now broadcasting a birthday tribute to the poet Philip Larkin, who's 50 today. George Macbeth introduces a number of poets reading and talking about their favorite Larkin poems.
Some years ago, when W.H. Auden was 60, we broadcast a birthday program in which a number of poets were invited to read their favorites from among his poems. Well, Philip Larkin is 50, and we've again invited a group of poets to choose and read their favorites from among his poems. And it's appropriate, I think, that the first one should be the poet still most generally recognized as the leading British poet now living, W.H. Auden himself.
It is a great privilege for me to be allowed to participate in this reading in honor of Mr. Larkin's birthday. I shall not waste time discussing his poems beyond saying what will be obvious to you as you listen. Firstly, that Mr. Larkin is a master of the English language, and secondly, that he has a unique voice of his own. Whatever models he may have had, he has completely assimilated them. I shall read 3 poems. The first one is called First Sight. Lambs that learn to walk in snow, when their beating clouds the air, meet a vast unwelcome, no, nothing but a sunless glare. Newly stumbling to and fro, all they find outside the fold is a wretched width of cold. As they wait beside the ewe, her fleeces wetly caked, there lies hidden round them, waiting too, earth's immeasurable surprise. They could not grasp it if they knew what so soon will wake and grow, utterly unlike the snow. Second one is called Next, Please. Always too eager for future, we pick up bad habits of expectancy. Something is always approaching every day. Till then, we say. Watching from a bluff, the tiny, clear, sparkling armada of promises draw near, how slow they are, and how much time they waste, refusing to make haste. Yet still they leave us holding wretched stalks of disappointment, for, though nothing balks each big approach, leaning with brasswork prinked, each rope distinct, flagged, and the figurehead with golden tits arching our way, it never anchors. It's no sooner present than it turns to past. Right to the last, we think each one will heave to and unload all good into our lives, all we are owed for waiting so devoutly and so long. But we are wrong. Only one ship is seeking us, a black-sailed unfamiliar, towing at her back a huge and birdless silence. In her wake, no waters breed or break. And the last one, title, No Road. Since we agreed to let the road between us fall to disuse, and bricked our gates up, planted trees to screen us, and turned all time's eroding agents loose, silence and space and strangers, our neglect has not had much effect. Leaves drift unswept, perhaps, grass creeps unmown, no other change. So clear it stands, so little overgrown, walking that way tonight would not seem strange, and still would be allowed. A little longer, and time will be the stronger. Drafting a world where no such road will run from you to me, to watch that world come up like a cold sun, rewarding others, is my liberty. Not to prevent it is my will's fulfillment. Winning it, my ailment.
Kingsley Amis, who reads next, was himself 50 earlier this year, and he and Larkin were contemporaries at St. John's College, Oxford, in the 1940s, and they've been close friends and associates ever since. They also share an enthusiasm for jazz, and it's not surprising, I think, that Amis should have chosen to read a poem with a jazz background.
I can find only 2 faults with Philip Larkin's poetry. There isn't enough of it, and in about 1 poem out of 3 was what I would call a willfully eccentric word.
Otherwise, he's got everything I look for, and mostly don't find, in a poet of our time. Clarity, sobriety, a way of catching and fixing a mood or the exact feel of a place or an event, and rarest of all, the most conscientious and unobtrusive craftsmanship. So far, so obvious. But there are two things about his work that some people are inclined to miss. One is its range in form, in subject matter, and in tone or feeling, all the way from a hearty jocularity, usually with an ironic edge, to a very deep and dark melancholy. The other point is that, again unobtrusively, he's doing what poets of his generation are often, and usually with justice, accused of not doing. Tackling the large, basic themes like love, natural beauty, the purpose of life, the passing of time, death, aging, and loss. Not a very joyful catalogue, but Larkin isn't a very joyful poet. Anyhow, if some of us don't appreciate this largeness of theme, it's because Larkin works up to it from small beginnings. A photograph, a bed sitting room, a shop, a view from a train or a ship, or, in the poem I picked, a jazz record. His significance and importance sneak up on you, as such things have a way of doing in life. You could even say that this is the central theme of a large part of Larkin's verse, how one moment our attention is occupied by some trivial and unedifying detail of daily existence, and then we suddenly seem to be standing at a vantage point from which we can see into the heart of our life and understand for a moment. Such understandings aren't usually very cheerful. As I said, Larkin isn't a poet for those who set a lot of store by their emotional comfort. This ability to salvage and commemorate the moment of insight out of a commonplace context is beautifully illustrated, I think, in reference back. The you referred to is the poet's mother. That was a pretty one. I heard you call from the unsatisfactory hall to the unsatisfactory room where I played record after record idly, wasting my time at home that you looked so much forward to. Oliver's Riverside Blues it was, and now I shall, I suppose, always remember how the flock of notes those antique Negroes blew out of Chicago air into a huge, remembering pre-electric horn the year after I was born. 3 decades later made this sudden bridge from your unsatisfactory age to my unsatisfactory prime. Truly, though our element is time, we are not suited to the long perspectives open at each instant of our lives. They link us to our losses. Worse, they show us what we have as it once was, blindingly undiminished, just as though by acting differently we could have kept it so.
Robert Conquest is another old friend of Larkin's, and again a poet more or less of his own generation. As editor of New Lines in the 1950s, he did a lot to define and promote the climate in which Larkin's poetry flourished. And as a fellow conservative, it's apt in his case, I think, that he should have chosen one of Larkin's more overtly political poems.
The poem I'm going to read, Homage to a Government, is not so much one of my favorites as one I feel to be a most original and interesting piece, which also importantly illustrates Larkin's whole poetic and personal stance. As to favorites, others have been read already. I might have chosen his poem in Homage to Sidney Bechet, the great jazz clarinetist. That note you hold, narrowing and rising, shakes like New Orleans reflected on the water. And so on, to its splendid, on me your voice falls as they say love should, like an enormous yes. That, too, significantly illustrates his attitude. But Homage to a Government is a poem which might seem to answer a much commoner contemporary demand for commitment, almost for political commitment. As usual, Larkin's answer is not the fashionable one. He looks back to the days of empire, whatever its faults, as a period of vision and scope, a broader time for Britain, not merely physically, but also in that the motives and feelings involved were not petty and self-seeking, as against what he sees as a constricted, economically obsessed present, This is no abstract principle expressing itself in agitprop jingles, not the excitable chatter of politicians so put down by Yeats, but, as ever, genuine feeling rooted deep in his and in the English consciousness, unemphatic and nostalgic in tone, expressing profounder moods. At once elegiac and satirical, it shows us a side of Larkin's poetic personality commonly neglected, but, I think, essential and inevitable. The poem was published in 1969. Homage to a Government. Next year, we are to bring the soldiers home for lack of money, and it is all right. Places they guarded or kept orderly must guard themselves and keep themselves orderly. We want the money for ourselves at home instead of working, and this is all right. It's hard to say who wanted it to happen, but now it's been decided, nobody minds. The places are a long way off, not here, which is all right. And from what we hear, the soldiers there only made trouble happen. Next year, we shall be easier in our minds. Next year, we shall be living in a country that brought its soldiers home for lack of money. The statues will be standing in the same tree-muffled squares and look nearly the same. Our children will not know it's a different country. All we can hope to leave them now is money.
One poet of a slightly older generation, whose technical precision and range of subject matter have something in common with the qualities admired by Larkin, is Roy Fuller, now Professor of Poetry at Oxford. His choice is an early poem, and almost one I think he might have written himself.
The tug between a precise iambic meter and the informality of a conversational style, meaning achieved by paying attention to the meter's stresses. These are characteristic features, to be very attractive ones, of Philip Larkin's poetry. I don't know whether they come out in reading his poems aloud. It's difficult anyway for an amateur reader to bring off. But perhaps a professional reader, an actor, would hardly be aware of the poet's skill in these matters. I've chosen an extremely charming poem called Lines on a Young Lady's Photograph Album. The poet has persuaded a girl to let him look at her album of snapshots. Few points in such a situation remain unilluminated by the end of the poem. The poem's in 5-line stanzas, each stanza with only 2 rhymes. The general meter is iambic pentameter, but the penultimate line of each stanza is a tetrameter. Another triumph of the poem is the syntactical complications and delayings achieved within such a strict prosodic scheme. Again, a daunting challenge to the reader aloud. I think I ought to add, as usual in Larkin's verse, behind the charm and wit is a very acute sense of human mortality. Lines on a Young Lady's Photograph Album. At last, you yielded up the album, which, once opened, sent me distracted. All your ages, matte and glossy, on the thick black pages. Too much confectionery, too rich. I choke on such nutritious images. My swivel eye hungers from pose to pose, in pigtails, clutching a reluctant cat, or third yourself, a sweet girl graduate, or lifting a heavy-headed rose beneath a trellis, or in a trilby hat, faintly disturbing that in several ways. From every side, you strike at my control, not least through these disquieting chaps who loll at ease about your earlier days. Not quite your class, I'd say, dear, on the whole. But oh, photography, as no art is, faithful and disappointing, that records dull days as dull, and hold its smiles as frauds, and will not censor blemishes like washing lines and Hall's distemper boards, but shows the cat as disinclined, and shades the chin as doubled when it is. What grace your candor thus confers upon her face. How overwhelmingly persuades that this is a real girl in a real place, in every sense empirically true. Or is it just the past? Those flowers, that gate, these misty parks and motors, lacerate simply by being over. You contract my heart by looking out of date. Yes, true. But in the end, surely, we cry not only at exclusion, but because it leaves us free to cry. We know what was, won't call on us to justify our grief, however hard we yowl across the gap from eye to page. So I am left to mourn, without a chance of consequence. You, balanced on a bike against a fence, to wonder if you'd spot the theft of this one of you bathing. To condense, in short, a past that no one now can share, no matter whose your future. Calm and dry, it holds you like a heaven, and you lie unvariably lovely there, smaller and clearer as the years go by.
Philip Larkin is, I suppose, with Ted Hughes, the most widely admired English poet to have emerged since the war. And it's interesting to see in Ted Hughes' selection of rather short poems those aspects of Larkin's work which have meant most to him.
All Larkin's poems are sad, and I like them all, but the sadder they are, the more I like them. Here is Absences, which I suppose is a poem about the desire to escape from himself. Rain patters on a floor that tilts and sighs. Fast-running floors collapsing into hollows, tower suddenly, spray-haired. Contrariwise, a wave drops like a wall. Another follows, wilting and scrambling, tirelessly at play, where there are no ships and no shallows. Above the sea, the yet more shoreless day, riddled by wind, trails lit up galleries. They shift to giant ribbing, sift away. Such attics cleared of me, such absences. And another short poem, which must certainly be at the center of the sadness in all his poems, called Going. There is an evening coming in across the fields, one never seen before, that lights no lamps. Silken it seems at a distance, yet when it is drawn up over the knees and breast, it brings no comfort. Where has the tree gone that locked earth to the sky? What is under my hands that I cannot feel? What loads my hands down? Finally, a poem called Days. This is also, I suppose, a sad one, but you can't feel that he's left much out either. What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us, time and time over. They are to be happy in. Where can we live but days? Ah, solving that question brings the priest and the doctor in their long coats running over the field.
Another poet of Hughes's generation who's always been a great admirer of Larkin is Anthony Thwaite. and he's been the first to publish many of Larkin's best recent verses in the New Statesman. He chooses a very well-known poem of Larkin's about love and death.
For myself, who's not only a dedicated admirer of Philip Larkin, but a dedicated antiquarian as well, I've always felt a tug of amusement against resentment in those lines from Church-Going about people who tap and jot and know what rood lofts were, those ruin bibbers randy for antique. I feel I'm being got at. So, among other things, it's a relief to find Larkin himself actually looking at an ancient ecclesiastical monument and evidently being moved by it. His poem, An Arundel Tomb, takes a medieval effigy and with characteristic accuracy and wit turns it into an image of the change and continuity of life. With him, we feel a sharp, tender shock at this almost fossilized proof that the future inexplicably, capriciously, and tenuously inherits the past. Larkin's poems are full of memories, that is, the surviving fragments of the past. Think of such poems as Reference Back, Dockery and Son, Maiden Name. But they're seldom attached to as remote and yet as solid an object as we have here. You can actually see this tomb in Chichester Cathedral if you want to. But perhaps what's most inimitably Larkinish about the poem is its scrupulous and wary refusal to make what someone else might have allowed to be a bigger, more extravagant gesture at the end. It is our almost instinct, almost true, no more. Such reticence is truly piercing and piercingly true. An Arundel Tomb. Side by side, their faces blurred, the Earl and Countess lie in stone, their proper habits vaguely shown as jointed armour, stiffened pleat, and that faint hint of the absurd, the little dogs under their feet. Such plainness of the pre-Baroque hardly involves the eye until it meets his left-hand gauntlet, still clasped empty in the other. And one sees with a sharp, tender shock his hand withdrawn, holding her hand. They would not think to lie so long. Such faithfulness in effigy was just a detail friends would see, a sculptor's sweet commissioned grace thrown off in helping to prolong the Latin names around the base. They would not guess how early in their supine, stationary voyage the air would change to soundless damage, turn the old tenantry away. How soon succeeding eyes begin to look, not read. Rigidly they persisted, linked through lengths and breadths of time. Snow fell, undated. Light each summer thronged the glass. A bright litter of bird calls strewed the same bone-riddled ground. And up the paths, the endless, altered people came, washing at their identity. Now, helpless in the hollow of an unarmorial age, a trough of smoke in slow, suspended skeins above their scrap of history, only an attitude remains. Time has transfigured them into untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon, and to prove our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love.
The youngest poet in this program, he is now, I think, 29, is Douglas Dunn, who for some years worked with Philip Larkin in the University Library at Hull. He begins by recalling a meeting with Larkin and some of his other fellow poets on the Faber and Faber list.
In May 1969, Ted Hughes, Richard Murphy, Philip Larkin and myself were gathered round a lunch table in a cottage Richard Murphy was renting in Lockington, a particularly beautiful village in the East Riding. We played a game. Each poet was to offer his definition of what he thought poetry was about. Ted Hughes' definition was just about as intense as his readers can imagine. Richard's, as those who know his elegant, clear verse might guess, had to do with purifying the language of the tribe. But Philip said, poetry is just like knitting. This shouldn't be taken as coy and domestic. It has to do with concentration. He believes, I think, that poets shouldn't marry. This might serve to indicate the level of dedication he expects of a poet and of himself. Writing poetry does involve personal and domestic risk in order to write to the ultimate of one's ability. One of the qualities I most admire of Philip Larkin, as a poet and as a man, is his kindness. There are prejudices and harsh enough ironies in his poems, and he can be devastatingly cutting in his vers de société. In a poem like At Grass, from The Less Deceived, a sense of love and an all-comprehending humanity, a sense of the world in the evening, is the quality that surpasses all others in the story and pictures of which the poem is made. At Grass is like a Victorian narrative painting, the kind of art he likes. It's still and composed, and yet animated in its own way. Not a cameo or a miniature, but a full canvas, intent on its subject and able to create the mood which suggests much more than the poem itself. Quietly dramatic, not abrasive, elegiac, and wholly successful as a work of art. At Grass. The eye can hardly pick them out from the cold shade they shelter in, till wind distresses tail and mane. Then one crops grass and moves about, the other seeming to look on, and stands anonymous again. Yet 15 years ago, perhaps 24 distances sufficed to fable them. Faint afternoons of cups and steaks and handicaps, whereby their names were artificed to inlay faded classic dunes. Silts at the start, against the sky numbers and parasols, outside squadrons of empty cars and heat and littered grass. Then the long cry, hanging unhushed till it subside to stop-press columns on the street. Do memories plague their ears like flies? They shake their heads, dusk brims the shadows. Summer by summer, all stole away, the starting gates, the crowds and cries, all but the unmolesting meadows. Almanacked, their names live. They have slipped their names and stand at ease, or gallop for what must be joy. And not a field glass sees them home, or curious stopwatch prophesies. Only the groom and the groom's boy, with bridles in the evening come.
Sir John Betjeman, of all the poets in tonight's programme, is perhaps the one closest in spirit to Larkin, and Larkin some years ago wrote one of the best reviews Betjeman's work has ever received in the little magazine Listen. Their admiration is mutual, and it's fitting, I think, that we should have a reading of two of Larkin's poems by John Betjeman, Toads Revisited, and perhaps his greatest poem, The Whitsun Weddings.
I chose The Whitsun Weddings because it's one of my favorite of Philip Larkin's poems. It describes Hull, where Philip Larkin lives and is librarian in the university, and Hull, if you don't know it, is at the end of everything, right on the east coast, the Bristol of the east coast. And it's a long railway journey along the northern bank of the Humber to Doncaster and then down to King's Cross. And the poem describes for me that remote peninsula, half sea, half sky. and the people between the two. That Whitsun, I was late getting away. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my 3/4 empty train pull out, all windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock, thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle, and canals with floatings of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely. Hedges dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first, I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made, each station that we stopped at. Sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade, and down the long, cool platforms, whoops and skirls, I took the porters larking with the mails and went on reading. Once we started, though, we passed them, grinning and pomaded, girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely, watching us go, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. The fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewelry substitutes, the lemons, mauves and olive ochres that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed aboard. The rest stood round. The last confetti and advice were thrown, and as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last, and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots, and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, "I nearly died," a dozen marriages got under way. They watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London, spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed, and as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss, came close, and it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain. This Toads Revisited has got the gloom of dear old Philip Larkin and the humour of him. Walking around in the park, I must tell you that the park and everything, I think, in the poem, these poems I've read of his, are about Hull. He lives near a public park. Walking around in the park should feel better than work. The lake, the sunshine, the grass to lie on, blurred playground noises beyond black-stockinged nurses. Not a bad place to be, yet it doesn't suit me, being one of the men you meet of an afternoon, palsied old step-takers, hair-eyed clerks with the jitters, waxed-fleshed outpatients, still vague from accidents, and characters in long coats deep in the litter baskets, all dodging the toad work by being stupid or weak. Think of being them, hearing the hours chime, watching the bread delivered, the sun by clouds covered, the children going home. Think of being them, turning over their failures by some bed of lobelias, nowhere to go but indoors, no friends but empty chairs. No, give me my in-tray, my loaf-haired secretary, my shall I keep the call-in, sir? What else can I answer when the lights come on at 4 at the end of another year? Give me your arm, old toad. Help me down Cemetery Road.
To end the programme, it's right that we should have Philip Larkin himself. He's a very reluctant reader and broadcaster of his own work, and it's a particular pleasure to have him on this special occasion of his 50th birthday, about which you'll hear he was characteristically witty in replying to my question how he felt about it, before reading a recent poem of his own choice.
Really, one should ignore one's 50th birthday. As anyone over 50 will tell you, it's no age at all. All the same, it is rather sobering to realize one has lived longer than Arnold of Rugby or Pawson, the 18th century professor of Greek. It's hard not to look back and wonder why one hasn't done more, or forward, and wonder what, if anything, you'll do in the future. I seem to have spent my life waiting for poems to turn up. That's probably a negative attitude, but writing isn't an act of the will. All you can do is try to make sure that when something does arrive, you aren't too tired or too busy or anything else to do it justice. As regards the future, I doubt if writers get better after they're 50, and I don't suppose I should be any exception. Can one find fresh things to say, or fresh ways of saying them? Will one develop? There's a great pressure on writers to develop these days. I think the idea began with Yeats, and personally I'm rather skeptical of it. What I should like to do is to write different kinds of poems that might be by different people. Someone once said that the great thing is not to be different from other people, but to be different from yourself. That's why I've chosen to read now a poem that isn't especially like me or like what I fancy I'm supposed to be like. It's called The Explosion. On the day of the explosion, shadows pointed towards the pit head. In the sun, the slag heap slept. Down the lane came men in pit boots, coughing oath-edged talk and pipe smoke, shouldering off the freshened silence. One chased after rabbits, lost them, came back with a nest of lark's eggs, showed them, lodged them in the grasses. So they passed, in beards and moleskins, fathers, brothers, nicknames, laughter, through the tall gates standing open. At noon, there came a tremor. Cows stopped chewing for a second. Sun, scarfed as in a heat haze, dimmed. The dead go on before us. They are sitting in God's house in comfort. We shall see them face to face. Plain as lettering in the chapels, it was said. And for a second, wives saw men of the explosion. Larger than in life they managed, gold as on a coin, or walking somehow from the sun towards them, one showing the eggs, unbroken.
In that program, George Macbeth was introducing birthday tributes to Philip Larkin by W.H. Auden, Kingsley Amis, Roy Fuller, Ted Hughes, Robert Conquest, Anthony Thwaite, Douglas Dunn, and John Betjeman. The program concluded with a contribution from Philip Larkin himself.